Here we're starting the chapter on personalities and personality theories and assessment. Now, the first part, which I'm going to be doing here now, is going to be looking at predominantly Freud's theory and Freud, around psychoanalysis and looking at his theory about personality. What's interesting about personality is that these theories try to help us explain what is our personality, where does it come from, is there a source for it? Or is it something that comes from other people, or is it something that comes from within? So we're going to start with Freud and psychoanalysis, and then we'll move into the neo-Freudians, or people who followed Freud, Jung and Adler, for example. And we'll look at those theories and look at what they sort of see and how they explain, or some of the key ingredients of their understanding about personality.
Okay, let's look at personality, and we'll consider what the definition is here. Personality, it's a pattern of enduring, meaning long-lasting, distinctive thoughts. So distinctive just means thoughts that you have that might be different from somebody else, emotions, and behavior that characterize the way the individual adapts to the world. So when you think about these sorts of things, you might be asked to say, so tell me about who you are, and when you describe who you are by some of these thoughts and emotions and behaviors and some traits, and we'll use that term later on, that might make sense. And so some of the words on those pencils are somewhat a bit of an example of it. And we're going to look at some theories here. And we're going to start off with the old style. And we're going to look at Freud's work, in particular around psychoanalysis perspective. They view personality as primarily an unconscious activity. That is, we don't focus, it doesn't come to us consciously. We don't think about our personality every day. That it is beyond our awareness. And as occurring in stages, most psychoanalytic perspectives emphasize the early experiences with parents and what that role plays in sculpting personality. And then psychoanalysis is the therapy for treating psychological disorders and a personality theory. So it's a bit of both. But Freud's there in the top right-hand corner. So it's looking at primarily unconscious, it develops in stages, and it emphasizes early experiences. Now, some of his work emphasized this sort of notion of there's a great deal of who we are personality-wise that's beneath the surface, and a very small amount, like an iceberg, that's above. So some definitions of terms here. If we're looking at the right-hand side, we have the conscious, which contains thoughts, feelings, and sensations or memories of which a person is aware of at any given moment. That's our conscious mind. The pre-consciousness this includes the thoughts, feelings, and memories that a person is not consciously aware of at the moment, but they're easily brought to your attention. If I was to ask you what your phone number is, you could put it together very quickly. It wasn't in your conscious mind until I asked it. It was in your pre-conscious. It's just outside, but you could call upon it very easily. And then the unconscious is the primary motivating source of all human behavior, containing repressed memories, as well as instincts, wishes, desires that have never been conscious. This is Freud's perspective. Now, what he did is he integrated that into another philosophy, if you will. He called the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the unconscious system of personality, which contains the life and death instinct and operates on the pleasure principle. It's the source of the libido. Now, much of what's Freud's work, as you'll see, has this sort of distinctive psychosexual, well, in fact, that's what he calls it, the psychosexual development of personality. And so when he uses the term libido and the pleasure principle, he's talking about this unknown element that is in all of us that drives a lot of what happens in our lives. The ego is the logical, rational, largely conscious system of personality which operates according to the reality principle. And then the superego is just in that pre-conscious area, is the moral system of personality which consists of the conscience and the ego ideal. Violating the superego's rules produces an unpleasant emotion of guilt or shame in the id, Obeying them produces a pleasant emotion of pride. These emotions motivate the ego to conform to the standards of the superego. So the superego is your moral compass, and as you navigate through the world, you make decisions. You make decisions about what you think, what you feel, and what you do. And when you make decisions that honor your code, your moral code, then you feel pride. And when you make decisions that compromise that code, you feel shame. And this is how Freud explains it. Now, he also introduced what he called repressive states, or defense mechanisms, sorry. And this list is in your textbook as well. And what you see here is a list of defense mechanisms, which is a means by which the ego defends against anxiety, and it tries to maintain self-esteem. Defense mechanisms are especially important when the ego is forced to choose to violate a superego's rules. All people use defense mechanisms to some degree. Overuse can adversely affect mental health. So what you can do is review these that you see here. You'll find this in your textbook, and see when and if you have used any of these before. Repressing isn't uncommon. Denial is not uncommon. Rationalizing is very common. Displacement is common. So you may find examples that you find in your own life. Now this next graphic is looking at Freud's psychosexual stages of development. Now, a series of stages through which the sexual instinct develops. Each stage is defined by an erogenous zone around which conflicts arise. And conflict is the basis of a lot of his work here. Now, he does argue there's a sex instinct. It's present at birth. Most important factor influencing personality, says Freud, develops through a series of psychosexual stages. Each stage centers on a part of the body that provides pleasurable sensations around which a conflict arises. Conflicts not readily resolved. Failure to resolve the conflict may have serious consequences, difficulty carrying over into adulthood. Now, fixation, this is an arrested development at a psychosexual stage occurring because of an excessive gratification or frustration at that stage. Fixation at the anal stage resulting from harsh parental pressure could lead to anal retentive personality characteristics by excessive stubbornness, rigidity, and neatness. So Freud argues. Now, psychology is indebted to Freud for introducing the idea that unconscious forces may motivate behavior. Now, that was something that he did innovate and was well received in psychology. The emphasis of influencing of early childhood experiences in later development. Many children who are rejected by their parents have behavioral and psychological difficulties later in life. Establishing a theory that may be better explaining the emotional aspects of psychological experience. Psychoanalysis is still a useful therapy tool today. Defense mechanisms provide useful categories for cognitive strategies people use to manage stress. But there certainly were criticisms to Freud's theories. They defy scientific testing. There was no scientific testing that Freud did. It was all anecdotal. Any behavior or lack of behavior could be interpreted as support for Freud's theory. There are very few strict Freudians among psychologists today. So what you see in on your screen there would be these stages: the oral stage, the anal stage, phallic stage, latency stage, and genital stage. And with these would be the conflicts and the adult traits that would emerge. A student of Freud, Carl Jung, had a slightly different perspective. He differed from Freud in that he did not think that the sexual instinct was the main factor in personality development, or that it was almost completely formed in childhood. He considered the middle age to be an important part of personality development. He also didn't agree with Freud regarding the structure of personality. So his alternative was to look at the ego, the part of the personality that carries out the day-to-day activities, secondary importance to the unconscious. The personal unconscious, or uniqueness, contains both our personal past, also repressed memories, wishes, desires, and and experiences accessible to the conscious. And then the collective unconscious, Jung's term for an impersonal, deepest layer of consciousness mind, shared by all human beings because of our common ancestral past. And then along with these lines, he had termed what he called archetypes, the name Jung gave to these emotionally laden ideas and images in a collective unconscious that have rich and symbolic meaning. When, as children, or we may even still today, have a fear of the dark, or in his argument, a belief in gods, evil spirits, these are things that he would describe as archetypes, and these would be based on our ancestral past. Moving along to Alfred Adler, he introduced a couple of concepts that you would be familiar with. One in particular, inferiority complex. This is the inferior feeling so strong that they can prevent personal development. He emphasized the unity of personality rather than the separate warring components of id, ego, and superego. Drive to overcome inferiority required a childhood motivates most of the behavior. So a drive to overcome inferiority is what motivates children to behave. People develop a unique style of life in early age that is used throughout life to achieve superiority. Consciousness, we can perceive the future, and this is what was important about Adler's work too. We could perceive the future, and therefore we could affect our future. We could set goals. We could achieve things by anticipating what we wanted to see in the future and plan to see that would occur. A Canadian, Karen Horney, she didn't agree with Freud, except for the significance of early childhood experience. The basic attitude toward life was important to her, either towards, against, or away from people. However, she saw personality personally developing over one's life, over the lifespan. And her work centered on two main themes: neurotic personality and feminine psychology. She believed that men and women, to be psychologically healthy, had to learn to overcome irrational beliefs about the needs for perfection. Now, her main themes, neurotic personality, did not accept id, ego, and superego, or the sexual instinct, and the psychosexual stages. She stressed the importance of early childhood experience, as well as cultural and environmental influences in personality. Neurotics were frequently trapped in a vicious cycle, or a vicious circle, in which their compulsive need to reduce basic anxieties leads to a variety of self-defeating behaviors. These behaviors then produce more basic anxieties, and the cycle continues. Personality could continue to develop through life. Now, feminine psychology, where many of the women's psychological difficulties arose from failure to live up the idealized version of themselves. Overcoming irrational beliefs about the need for perfection required that psychological health for both men and women to influence the modern cognitive behavior therapies. So she was quite influential in terms of, she was controversial in her own right, and yet she was quite influential in particular in terms of feminine psychology. So this will be done in part 1, and we're going to go into part 2. I'll post that as well. Okay, good luck.